General Hospital spoilers tease that real life may soon reshape the world of Port Charles in ways no one saw coming. For decades, the character of Scott Baldwin has been a cornerstone in the intricate web of General Hospital storylines, a man full of contradictions, fighting legal battles by day and personal demons by night. But now, the man behind the role, Kin Shriner, faces a real-world trial that no script could soften. It began with a quiet social media post, simple, even unremarkable at first glance. Kin shared that he had undergone ankle surgery about a year ago. Fans had wondered about his absence, theorizing various off-screen arcs, but no one imagined the truth. The surgery had failed. The man known for his fiery courtroom monologues and relentless energy had been grounded, literally, for months. 6 months of recovery, with no guarantee of resolution. As Port Charles moved on without Scott Baldwin, Kin Shriner was fighting a more private war. Against pain, disappointment, and the fear that the character he had embodied for so long might not survive his silence. More recently, Kin updated fans that he had undergone a second surgery. There was hope in his tone, but also hesitation. The glimmers of optimism were dulled by the raw honesty of his words. He was recovering, yes, but that didn't mean he was okay. Not yet. And that's where the real story begins. Inside the GH writers' room, tough conversations were already taking place. Scott Baldwin couldn't simply disappear forever. If Kin couldn't return, and that was becoming a very real possibility, then something had to be done. Something definitive. Talk turned toward the idea of writing Scott out permanently. Not through a slow fade, but with finality. Death. In Port Charles, a somber ripple moved quietly through the town. It began with a phone call and off-screen tragedy. The news came from a distant hospital in Buenos Aires, where Scott had been traveling for a legal outreach program. A car accident. Complications. A failed surgery. Lisa Labrecht was the first to hear, and the weight of the words nearly crushed her. She returned to town in a daze, stepping off the train at the Port Charles station with nothing but her purse and an expression carved from disbelief. The icy doctor, once capable of cruelty in pursuit of love or revenge, now looked hollowed out. Her love, her partner in chaos and comfort, gone. Liesl went straight to General Hospital, bypassing reception and brushing off concerned glances from old colleagues. She made her way to a quiet bench near the nurse's hub and sat down without a word. Elizabeth Weber approached cautiously. "Dr. Abrecht," she said gently. "Is everything all right?" Liesl turned to her with a voice like glass. "Scott is dead." The words fell like a stone. The news spread faster than anyone expected. In a town that had seen more than its fair share of death, Scott's passing still shook the ground. He wasn't just another name on a list, he was a thread woven through every era of Port Charles life. Laura Collins, upon hearing the news, locked her office door and didn't come out for an hour. Franco Baldwin's memory came rushing back to many, his complicated bond with Scott, the tension, the breakthroughs, the unspoken forgiveness they never quite reached before Franco's own death. Lucy Coe fell apart mid-meeting. Valentin had to excuse her before she burst into sobs, unable to finish a sentence. She and Scott had shared decades of chaos, flirtation, even begrudging admiration. Now he was just gone. And then there was Liesl. Her grief didn't unfold with screaming or dramatic outbursts. Instead, it lived in silences. In the way she stared at his old coffee mug still sitting in her cupboard, in the way she called his number out of habit and heard the hollow ring that never picked up. Maxie tried to get her to eat. Britt's memory hovered in the air, another loss too fresh. But Liesl declined, retreating into herself. In a quiet scene at the cemetery, a few of Scott's closest allies gathered near an empty grave, the body not yet recovered, the casket symbolic. Max Scorpio gave the eulogy. His voice shook as he remembered the man Scott used to be: reckless, arrogant, infuriating, and the man he became, dependable, loyal, a warrior for those he loved, even when they didn't deserve it. There were no trumpets, no grand montage. Just memories. And pain. The kind of grief that sticks around long after the credits roll. Behind the scenes, the show's writers were facing the same question viewers were now asking: how do you move forward without Scott Baldwin? One option being explored: Posthumous revelations. A secret Scott had been keeping, maybe a child no one knew about, or a legal battle that would entangle half the town. Something that would keep his legacy alive and give the character a lasting footprint. There were whispers about bringing in a new character connected to Scott, a young lawyer from out of town who arrives claiming to be Scott's mentee, or even an estranged daughter. The kind of twist General Hospital does best. One that would allow the spirit of the character to echo through new conflicts and relationships, without replacing what Kin Shriner created. But for now, Port Charles was simply grieving. Back at the hospital, Liesl stood in Scott's old office, untouched since his last day there. She ran her fingers along the edge of his desk, stopping at a photograph, an old one of them at a fundraiser, both of them mid-laugh, years younger, lighter. She whispered to the silence, "You said you'd be back. You promised." And then, finally, she cried. Out in the hallway, Epiphany watched through the glass and said quietly to Monica Quartermain, "He never knew how many lives he changed." Monica nodded. "We all thought we had more time. In Port Charles, time has never been generous. But memories are. And for Scott Baldwin, those memories are now all that remain, fiercely protected, deeply mourned, and etched into the heart of the town forever." Liesl Albrecht hadn't slept in days. The apartment felt different now, colder, too quiet. She hadn't moved the envelope Scott left behind in his desk drawer, the one marked with her name and sealed with a red wax stamp. It had been days since the news of his death broke, and yet she still hadn't brought herself to open it. The absence wasn't just emotional. It was haunting. Port Charles was full of ghosts, and Scott Baldwin had just joined them. But grief, especially for Liesl, didn't stay quiet for long. It mutated. Hardened. Her return to town had originally been rooted in a desire to reconnect, perhaps restart what she and Scott once had. But now her return had a new purpose: of vengeance, clarity, closure. And that meant digging into every detail of Scott's final days. The accident in Buenos Aires didn't add up. She was a doctor. She knew how to read autopsy reports and medical statements. Something was off. Something was hidden. Meanwhile, word of Scott's death reached Kin's on-screen companions, those whose lives had collided with his for decades. Lucy Coe had gone into a near-constant state of isolation. At Deception, business halted. Sasha tried to step up but eventually admitted Lucy's absence wasn't about business loss, it was personal devastation. Lucy had lost her longest game of will they won't they. Then came the twist. Felicia uncovered a curious transfer of funds made from Scott's account just 2 days before the alleged accident. A large payment wired to a clinic in Mexico under a different name. Not Scott's. Not Liesl's. But a name they hadn't seen in years: Serena Baldwin. Liesl's heart stopped the moment Felicia shared the detail. Serena had vanished from Port Charles a long time ago. She had chosen distance from Scott, from the courtroom circus, from the endless emotional wreckage. But now? A sudden reappearance in financial records? Liesl couldn't ignore the suspicion bubbling inside her. Serena had come back, or never left, and Scott had known. And perhaps this whole tragic narrative wasn't as straightforward as a car accident at all. Determined, Liesl began to track down Serena, using her connections in WSB databases and offshore medical directories. The trail led to a remote clinic outside Tijuana, an experimental orthopedic facility known for taking extreme medical cases. One of its specialties? Failed ankle reconstructions. Liesl finally opened Scott's envelope. Inside were 2 things. A photograph of him and Serena dated only a month earlier, and a single line scribbled in his handwriting: "Whatever happens, protect her." The room spun. Back in Port Charles, Lucy finally broke her silence and visited the hospital. She wasn't ready to talk to Liesl yet, but she needed answers. She approached Elizabeth, voice trembling. Was there anything in his file, any sign that he wasn't really planning to come back? Elizabeth hesitated, then shared that Scott had made a cryptic call to the hospital administrator only 2 weeks earlier, requesting medical leave longer than expected, but not permanent. He had sounded hopeful. Even made a joke about needing his old briefcase dusted off. It didn't sound like a man preparing to die. Elsewhere, Rick Lansing received an anonymous envelope at his law office. It contained a single photograph, grainy but clear, of Scott Baldwin in what appeared to be the Tijuana Clinic courtyard. Alive. Walking with a brace. The photo was dated 4 days after the supposed date of death. Rick's stomach dropped. He immediately called Ava. "We have a problem," he said. Ava, who had only just started recovering from the storm Christina unleashed on her personal life, bristled. "Unless it's about Alexis or the custody documents, don't bother me." Rick hissed. "Scott isn't dead." Ava's silence was all the confirmation he needed. She knew the game had changed again. They were both deep in legal manipulation involving the Cassadine estate, riding the chaos of Alexis's fear and Christina's impulsiveness. If Scott was alive and worse, in hiding, he could unravel everything. Scott knew things. Things about Rick's offshore accounts. Things about Ava's blackmail ledger. Things they couldn't risk coming back to the surface. "Find out who's helping him," Ava said sharply. "If Serena's involved, she's the key." And speaking of Christina, she was spiraling. Her plans with Cody had backfired. Not only had Ava grown suspicious, but Cody had gone radio silent after the last encounter. Christina wasn't sure if he'd defected, double-crossed her, or worse, caught feelings. She confronted him behind Charlie's pub. Cody looked like hell, tired, anxious, guilty. "You were supposed to stay close to her," Christina snapped. "You were supposed to expose her." Cody rubbed his face. "It's not that simple anymore." Christina narrowed her eyes. "Are you in love with her?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know this, she's not the enemy." Christina stepped back like he'd slapped her. She had trusted Cody with more than just money, she trusted him with her revenge. And now, he was protecting the very woman she swore had ruined her family. "Don't come near me again," she whispered. But Ava was watching them from across the street, a camera lens peeking from the tinted window of her black SUV. She wasn't just trying to protect herself anymore. She was building a case. Against all of them. Cody. Rick. Christina. Even Alexis, if she had to. Back at General Hospital, Liesl began putting the pieces together faster than anyone expected. Serena had faked Scott's death to protect him from something or someone. And the only person who might know what was truly happening? Jack Brennan. Jocelyn's return to Port Charles had shaken Carly, especially when her daughter shared the details about Vaughn and the Five Poppies retreat in Dalmatia. But what rattled Carly even more was the connection Jocelyn revealed. Jack Brennan had ties to the same clinic in Mexico where Scott was spotted. "I think Brennan orchestrated the cover-up," Joss said. "He's involved in whatever Scott was running from." Carly connected the dots. Vaughn, Brennan, the Five Poppies. It wasn't a spa trip. It was a quarantine. Or worse, containment. In a final twist, Liesl tracked Serena to a hidden safe house just outside the Mexico border. Serena looked older, sharper. No longer the wide-eyed girl Port Charles remembered. "You faked your father's death," Liesl said quietly. "I saved his life," Serena replied. "He was being hunted." "By who?" Serena hesitated, then said one word: Rick. In Port Charles, Rick poured himself a scotch and stared at the photo again. If Scott was alive, everything he'd built, all the control, all the carefully maintained leverage, was in jeopardy. He'd spent months ensuring Scott's silence, and now it was unraveling. There was only one way out. He picked up the phone. "Clean it up," he said. "I don't care what it takes." And miles away, in a small clinic still lit by harsh white light, Scott Baldwin finally opened his eyes. The second surgery had worked. Barely. His voice was rough, but clear: "Get me home." Because the dead man of Port Charles had one more fight left in him. And this time, he wasn't going down quietly. The plane touched down at a private airstrip just outside Port Charles, cloaked in fog and secrecy. Scott Baldwin was back, not to resume life as it was, but to set fire to the house of cards built in his absence. Serena stood by the tarmac, her jaw tight, eyes scanning the treeline. She didn't trust anyone anymore, and she'd made sure no one followed them. The last 3 weeks had shown her how far people were willing to go to silence, to erase, to bury the past. What they hadn't counted on was Scott surviving. He stepped onto the runway, walking without crutches now, each step deliberate. He looked older, thinner, but there was fire in his eyes, the kind that made prosecutors stutter and liars sweat. His silence had been a shield. Now, his voice would be a weapon. Back in town, Rick Lansing stood in his law office, rattled but composed. He'd received word the safe house had been compromised. No body. No confirmation. Only silence, which, in Rick's world, was worse than noise. The kind of silence that meant Scott had slipped through. And if Scott talked, if he connected the dots between Rick, the Cassadine ledgers, the offshore accounts, the money laundering, then everything crumbled. Ava was one step ahead. She'd already moved her blackmail files to a secure server and begun assembling allies, not friends, but people with something to lose. Her call to Valentine had been brief. Her meeting with Selena Wu was even briefer. Protection wasn't loyalty, it was leverage. And Ava understood leverage better than anyone. But she didn't expect Scott to make his reappearance so public. It happened at the mayor's charity gala, a night full of champagne and polished lies. Laura Collins had just finished her speech, praising the resilience of Port Charles, when a quiet hush swept through the crowd. And then he stepped in. Scott Baldwin. Alive. Gasps echoed. Cameras clicked. Laura froze mid-breath. Lucy's champagne glass slipped from her hand. Even Liesl, who had known this moment was coming, couldn't stop her heart from seizing in her chest. "I'd say it's good to be back," Scott said into the microphone on stage, "but that depends on who's listening." He stared directly at Rick. "And who's running?" Rick's expression didn't change, but everyone noticed his sudden stillness. The next morning, the fallout began. Scott gave an exclusive interview to The Invader, detailing his recovery, the staged death, and the betrayal that forced his disappearance. Without naming names, he hinted at powerful players manipulating legal systems and family fortunes. People with Cassadine ties. People connected to WSB. People like Rick Lansing. Within hours, the Attorney General's office quietly reopened an old investigation into Cassadine estate fraud. Christina, watching the news from her apartment, felt the walls closing in. Cody had ghosted her. Her plans with Ava had collapsed. Rick wasn't returning her calls. For the first time, she saw it clearly: she'd gambled her family's safety for petty revenge, and she'd lost everything. Across town, Liesl finally confronted Scott at his old apartment. "You should have told me," she said softly. "I couldn't," he replied. "You'd have followed me. I would have protected you." "I know." They stood in silence, the weight of their pain pressing the air between them. "Is it over?" Liesl asked. Scott looked out the window. "Not yet. But the reckoning's begun." And it had. Lucy Coe launched a wrongful death lawsuit against the Buenos Aires clinic, using it as cover to subpoena financial documents linked to Rick's offshore accounts. Serena filed a motion to freeze the estate transfer Rick had orchestrated while Scott was presumed dead. Alexis, reluctantly at first, agreed to testify to the timeline of Cassadine ledger anomalies, implicating Rick and protecting her daughters. Even Ava made a move. Carefully leaking redacted documents to the press implicating Rick in the misuse of WSB routing codes to disguise funds. Her name was never mentioned, but the implication was clear: she'd flipped. As for Rick Lansing, his empire collapsed in 48 hours. The Bar Association suspended his license pending investigation. His firm's partners withdrew. By the end of the week, he'd quietly left Port Charles, destination unknown. The man who once prided himself on controlling the chessboard had been taken off it entirely. But it wasn't victory that settled over the town. It was exhaustion. Scott sat in the hospital chapel one evening, alone, turning his wedding band in his fingers. He hadn't worn it in years. But now, with so much lost and exposed, he felt its weight again. Not as a memory, but as a reminder, legacy mattered. Liesel found him there. Sat beside him without speaking. Finally, Scott said, "I'm not sure where I go from here." Liesel replied, "Then let's not go anywhere. Just sit." And they did. Outside, Port Charles exhaled. Not because the war was over, but because, for now, the truth had finally spoken louder than the lies.